is here with the top stories in the African news. Georgia, what are you looking at today?
Well, Catherine, Doctors Without Borders said that it's pulling out of Somalia because authorities aren't doing enough to protect its staff. Also, the UN Security Council discusses Central African Republic's crisis, and the captain behind the coup that kicked off Mali's recent troubles has been promoted. First, killings, abductions, violence. After 22 years in Somalia, Doctors Without Borders has had enough of attacks on its aid workers and says that it's pulling out. Now, the decision follows the release of a man convicted of gunning down two of the organisation's workers back in 2011. Now, he served just a few months of his sentence before being freed. Since 1991, 16 employees of the body, also known as Médecins Sans Frontières, or MSF in French, have lost their lives in Somalia. It's long been plagued by armed conflict and a jihadist insurgency. MSF accuses authorities of supporting attacks on its people. Well, I'm joined by Denis Gouzer from MSF. Denis, thanks very much for coming in. Now, MSF has been in Somalia, sticking it out for decades. What has suddenly taken it all to be too much?
Yes, as you mentioned, you have been working for 22 years in Somalia, so it's a long period of time. And we decided, after maybe two main events we had during the last 2 years. The first one was the killing of two expatriates in 2011, and then the kidnapping, the abduction of two others. Expatriates. So after the two events, we really decided that it was too much for us to continue to work because we don't have any security or any real security from the authorities. And when we talk about authorities, we talk about all the authorities. I mean, political authorities, military authorities, armed groups. So we no more have enough security to continue to work in Somalia now.
Now, you said it's actually going beyond just not enough security. You've actually accused the authorities of tacitly either aiding or allowing attacks on your staff. Now, why would they do that when essentially you're doing their job?
Yeah, it's for the responsible of the murderer. The murderer of our expatriate in 2011 was put in charge after 3 months, and after 3 months they decided to release the guy. So for us it was unacceptable, to be free after only 3 months. Means the people are still now in the street and they can continue to be with MSF, or to follow MSF, and with absolutely no consequences for him. So it's unacceptable for us to have somebody free, accused to be the murderer of one MSF, and then to be free after 3 months.
Now, everyone can understand your outrage, but in some ways, isn't this taking your ball back? I mean, this is at a time when the most vulnerable perhaps need you the most.
Yeah, for sure. The situation, it's really difficult for Somali population now, and we know that. And it was a real difficult decision for us to leave Somalia, because we have been working for 20 years and we know the situation really. But in fact, it's absolutely unacceptable for us to continue to work in country where the representatives, I mean the political government, the armed groups, don't have the capacity to protect our service, to protect our expatriates, to protect our people working, to protect our structure. Even our medical structure have been attacked. So we have been abducted, we have been killed, we have been threats. I think after 20 years, it was really too much. It's why we decided, and once again, it was very difficult for us to take the decision, but we decided to withdraw.
Well, thanks very much. Denis Gouzer there from Médecins Sans Frontières, which has announced that it's pulling out of Somalia. Now, this comes as the world's most serious outbreak of polio takes hold in the country. Since the first case was identified in Mogadishu, the number of infections has exploded. Aid workers have struggled to stay one step ahead of Somalia's dangers and obstacles and vaccinate as many people as they can.
A new outbreak of polio in Somalia, not helped by a spiralling security situation. The country had been polio-free for 6 years, but the disease returned in May and has spread rapidly.
My son was fine, but he started having a high fever which lasted for almost 4 days. I gave him medicine, but there was no change. The following morning, he said to me, "Mom, I can't stand up." I asked him what was wrong. I looked down at his leg and saw it was swollen. I helped him to stand up, but his whole leg was paralyzed.
Conflict across the country has prevented NGOs from getting to people in need of immunization. Somalia has the largest known group of unvaccinated children in the world, so under fives are the priority. However, adults are also being vaccinated in some areas.
There are a lot of people who have not been vaccinated in the past. Some of them have a very weak immune system, and they cannot defend themselves from disease, so they end up becoming very sick.
The outbreak could set UNICEF and the World Health Organization back in their aim of eradicating polio worldwide by 2018. That also hasn't been helped by Médecins Sans Frontières' decision to pull out of Somalia after 22 years due to the sustained threat on its staff. Their departure is expected to affect hundreds of thousands of people, among them Somalia's most needy.
Now, Central African Republic is at risk of becoming a failed state. That was the warning from top UN officials today as they called on the Security Council to help the African Union restore order to the country. It was plunged into chaos by a coup back in March, and Central African Republic was in a bad way even before former Seleka rebels took over running it. Hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced, and aid agencies have warned that the health system is practically non-existent. Well, Nick Harper is in New York at the UN's headquarters for France 24. He joins us now. Nick, now, there have been all these reports of rogue rebels killing, looting and terrorising communities with impunity. Now, even if the Security Council does support this new mission, how is that going to affect the government's response to abuses by the fighters that put them in power in the first place?
Well, I think in many respects, it's unlikely to make much of a difference. The United Nations has appealed to the government in the Central African Republic on a number of occasions, but hasn't seen any sort of response. I suppose it is interesting to note that the United Nations does, it would seem to be taking this situation seriously. They held this special briefing today, a meeting to discuss the situation on the ground, the first of its kind since May. And at this briefing, we heard from a number of top UN officials, all of them talking about the fact that the CAR was now spiralling towards chaos. Valerie Amos, like you mentioned, talked about the fact there was a real worry that it would become a failed state. And everyone who spoke today talked about the fact that more needed to be done. Valerie Amos said that the money that was trying to be raised, the appeal fund, had only reached 32%, and well over $100 million was still needed for many, many millions of people in the country who urgently need humanitarian assistance. So the United Nations are doing lots. They potentially could support this new mission, but even if they do, there's unlikely to be much change on the ground, it would seem.
Now, is there much faith in the new leader, Michel Djokodier's promise that he's committed to steering the country to fresh polls?
Well, I think there is a privately held view here at the United Nations that that's probably not going to happen. He's talked about scheduling an election for 2016, whether that happens then or whether it happens earlier. There seems to be generally held opinion here that there is a worry about whether or not that election will actually happen. And I think you have to consider that the spiralling situation to kind of take it into context. We have a country where at the moment there's 200,000 people who've been internally displaced. We've got more than 1.5 million people who the United Nations say are desperately in need of humanitarian assistance. And we heard from Save the Children yesterday. They put out a report that said 100,000 children were now at risk of sexual violence or being recruited into militia. So the Secretary General here at the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, has urged the Security Council to look at the possibility of sanctions. That's something that they're considering, and we should be hearing more on that news in the coming days and weeks.
Thanks very much. Nick Harper there for France 24 in New York. In a quick look at some other news, a month-long state of emergency has been declared in Egypt after 149 people were killed in the country's bloodiest day in decades. Scores of victims died in clashes on Wednesday as security forces stormed Cairo protest camps set up by supporters of ousted President Mohamed Morsi. Now, this was the culmination of 6 weeks of standoff between the Islamist pro-Morsi movement and the new army-backed government that deposed him. Today's violence spread to cities around the country, prompting international calls for restraint from the military. And the army captain who led the coup that plunged Mali into over a year of turbulence and fighting has been promoted. Outgoing President Diakonde Traore on Wednesday signed the order making Captain Amadou Sonego a general. Now, the move comes just days after former Prime Minister Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, who maintains good relations with the new general, was voted in as the next country's president. Rights groups have slammed the decision to reward Sonego. He faces accusations of a range of rights abuses over the last year. That wraps up African news for me for now, but I will be back with more in an hour, Catherine.
All right, thanks very much indeed. Georja Calvin-Smith there with the latest news from Africa. Well, do stay tuned here to France 24. We'll, of course, have the very latest news for you and everything that's the developments in Egypt. That's with my colleague Mark Owen in just a few minutes' time.